Worth it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr. Speaker, this is a serious piece of legislation, and I begin by referencing the previous Speaker's last couple of sentences, where he talked about the need to improve financial flexibility by encouraging innovation. Now, that of itself is a worthy principle, until you look at the other parts of this bill, where, as my colleague Chris Hipkins has said, the truncation and contraction of parliamentary scrutiny. That's about financial flexibility, all right, and that's about innovation. That's about this government trying to be innovative with the figures, flexible with the truth, and contracting the Parliament and the Select Committee's right to scrutinise how public funds are spent, the financial performance of departments, and cut it down. Now, Chris Hipkins referenced a very interesting point, that normally these changes, where you change how select committees operate, these changes are made through the Standing Orders Committee. And why are they made through the Standing Orders Committee? Well, I just referenced that eminent book by Dave McGee, Parliamentary Practice in New Zealand. And the reason you have a Standing Orders Committee, unlike a chamber process where we are partisan and we do divide, is because, and I quote, the committee, that is the Standing Orders Committee, operates by endeavouring to find a consensus on its proposals rather than these being merely recommendations of a majority of the committee. And by that, Dave McGee means that when proposals go to change the standing orders and the processes of this chamber, and by definition its select committees, that there is buy-in generally by the overwhelming majority, if not all the parties in this parliament, that we buy into it because it is an appropriate thing to do. Now, I want to take the people of New Zealand who might be listening through a little bit of the parliamentary process, because not many people are au fait with what we do on select committees. There are two opportunities to scrutinise a department and a minister on how they appropriate and for what purpose they appropriate public funds, and then through a financial review process to examine that department as to how they have utilised and performed utilising those funds and met outcomes and objectives. And what this bill does, and normally a select committee, and members on this side of the House of all parties will know this, you get about an hour in the budget process and the appropriations process, about an hour, because the majority rules, normally that hour to examine those appropriations when the minister who is responsible for them is in the chair, you get an hour. And that hour is normally made up of, and National Party ministers are very professional at it, of a good 10 or 15 minutes worth of presentation. Judith Collins, I remember, was fond of coming into the Law and Order Select Committee with guns and drugs. David Clendon will remember this, drugs and all sorts of paraphernalia, pepper spray. I think she was going to use it on a couple of her colleagues. And she'd take up half an hour of the process with a sort of sound and light show. So you're left with sort of 45 minutes, and of those 45 minutes, the government takes about a third of that, and the opposition, whose day it is to actually scrutinise those appropriations, gets about 20 to 30 minutes of the whole process. So for the people of New Zealand who are listening, that's all you get, your opposition representatives get, because you know damn well the government, apart from John Hayes, who on the Select Committee has become a specialist in asking some very penetrating questions on behalf of the opposition, a few we feed to him, and he brasses his chairman Todd McLeod off a bit. But in terms of holding a minister and a department and a government to account, you get about 20 or 30 minutes. And then later in the year, around September, October, a similar process happens, 1 hour, no minister, because it's the financial review process, looking at what the government and the department's done with the dough. And again, there's about 50 minutes, 10 of a presentation, then the government has a crack, and there's about 30 minutes left to actually hold them to account. So that gives you about an hour in the whole 12-month financial year. What these guys want to do is combine both those processes. Are they saying there's going to be double time to actually examine those votes, combine them into one process, not using the Dave McGee principle of going through standing orders where there is general consensus general consensus with a proper process to change the standing orders, but I know they want to create, to quote Todd McClay, improve financial flexibility and encourage innovation. Oh yeah, this is a huge innovation because it allows a government and every minister, and through the minister, the chief executive and the department, to abrogate their responsibility to front up so that this parliament, through its select committee process, can examine, hold their feet to the fire, answer questions which they must answer in front of journalists and the public, and be accountable for the money that they spend and appropriate. And we know that this government, if you look at, say, SOEs, the legislation that Tony Ryle championed, we now have SOEs taken out of public scrutiny. No OIA, Official Information Act request is applicable to those SOEs which are gone on the block to be sold. No parliamentary questions, no select committee process, no ombudsman, a complete lack of parliamentary scrutiny, even though, at the very least, the taxpayer may, if they're lucky, end up retaining 51% of them. We know also that this government, when it comes to Official Information Act requests, has broken every protocol. We know there are a record number of complaints before the Ombudsman. You cannot even get out of these geniuses a list of the reports that they've received, even the titles, because they will not offer those, they will not provide those. And the best example is actually Hiki Parata, who on the options paper for closing schools in Canterbury simply refused day after day and week after week to release that information because she said it wasn't germane to those schools. Well, those schools and those communities believed absolutely it was germane because they wanted to know the rationale or lack of rationale and logic behind Hiki Parata's decision to put the axe through them. So this is very, very important legislation, and we oppose it on those grounds. We don't, as the last speaker said, as he sort of sprayed across the House, you know, if we oppose this, we're against efficiency in the public service. Rubbish. The way you get better productivity, better professionalism, better accountability is through openness and transparency and scrutiny to ask the ministers and the chief executives and the boards of those entities the tough questions on what they did, what they achieved, why they messed up, and how they executed the public funds that the taxpayer provided to them. And you get about 2 hours a year to do it, and a few questions which they bat around. And this crew, and they should stand up and justify why it is and why they want to halve that process, combine it and truncate it so there is less scrutiny. We're going to have the Minister for Earthquake Recovery before a select committee, rather an important portfolio for people down my way and for people in New Zealand as a whole, to front up with Sarah for the financial review. And again, we're going to get 1 hour to put him through his paces, to try and get some questions answered in respect of what is happening and what is not happening down in Christchurch. And if this legislation goes through, then the next year, or when it receives royal assent, the following year, that process will be truncated and halved. Now that's not on. Oh, what about question time? Well, you see, there you go. There you go. For Mr Hayes, he says, what about the Official Information Act? And what about question time? Well, here's what we have. At the moment, Mr Hayes, we have question time. We have the OIA, and we have the added scrutiny of select committees, which you may not value, he may not value. So Mr Hayes says, halve the select committee process, halve the scrutiny, but you guys should be satisfied as taxpayers. Taxpayers should be satisfied because there's question time and there's the OIA. Well, the problem with the OIA, of course, as we've said, is the Ombudsman is buried in OIA complaints because Mr Hayes' ministers will not front up with information, will not front up, or money, and Hiki Parata and her holding back of the options paper on the schools in Christchurch is an example of that. Now, for Mr Hayes, a few questions each day in Parliament, and the odd OIA, which his ministers can bat around and delay and refuse, that's enough scrutiny for him. That's enough scrutiny. This is the man, of course, who said with the retail deposit guarantee scheme, when his government lost about $500 million on behalf of the taxpayer, quote unquote, that's loose change, said John Hayes. These guys have to stand up, and we want to know why they want to truncate our right on behalf of the people to scrutinise this government.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member Holly Walker.